This 67 Mustang convertible has been featured in a lot of CJ Pony Parts videos, anywhere from a T5 swap to a full engine swap. Well, today it's going to get a huge suspension upgrade thanks to Ridetech. So when we hit up Ridetech for suspension for a 67, not only did they send us a whole bunch of boxes, they sent us John here to tell us about these parts and help us install them. Now, what did you bring today for our 67 convertible?
When we first talked and you told me about the upgrade you made to the car, I felt that the best system for you guys was going to be the bolt-in 4-link coilover kit. You're going to get upper and lower control arms with improved geometry, the coilover system, the 4-link cradle with the upper and lower bars. I also upgraded you to the new R-joint rod ends, all the bolt-in brackets, the hardware, the ball joints, everything you're going to need to swap this over.
And everything is bolt-in.
Complete bolt-in.
Nothing crazy, no cutting, no changing out anything?
No cutting. No cutting, only some minor welding on the rear end housing for the upper bars. But other than that, it's all going to be bolt-in.
What kind of adjustability does the suspension have as far as spring rates, shock struts? Obviously everything's included, but what kind of adjustability do we have?
That's correct. In your coilovers, if you needed to change the spring rate based on your engine size, that's easy to do. We can actually swap those out before we send you the kit. In the rear, you're going to have pinion angle adjustability. The caster is going to be improved with the upper and lower control arms. Ball joint angles optimized for a lower ride height. Ball joints are going to be included. And then we've also sent in the lower brackets for your 4-link to keep the system bolt-in.
Now this is going to be 67 through 70?
That's correct.
Now is this kit, are there any limitations on the car? Does it like have to have disc brakes? Does it have to be a V8 or anything like that?
No, on this particular car where you have the factory spindles and factory drum brakes, you're not ready to make that upgrade yet. On this car with the 67 to 70 kit, it all bolts on.
Great, let's get started with the installation. For this installation, you need a lift or a jack and jack stands and a well-stocked toolbox with a good selection of wrenches, ratchets, and sockets. So we got the car off the ground, got the wheels and tires off. Now it's disassembly time. Now John here's gonna handle the installation. Me and Brendan are gonna help him, but the first thing we're gonna do is remove our sway bar. Now we're up in the engine bay, we're going to unbolt the shocks so we can start removing the suspension. The next thing we're going to do is loosen up the export brace. Now we do have an aftermarket one on this car. It will work with our new suspension. We'll have to drill some new holes in it, but it is going to be usable. But for now, we're going to unbolt it to get it out of the way to make the installation easier. Now with the shotgun bolts, what we're going to do here is lift up the whole suspension. So we take the weight off it and remove the shock mount.
To remove the bump stop bracket, we're going to remove the bolts on the inside of the engine cradle. This will allow that to come out and allow us to put the spring compressor on. To compress the spring, we're going to drop the spring compressor in through the shock mount, attach it to the spring, we'll use an impact to compress it.
Okay, now we have the spring compressor. We're going to work on removing the control arm. Now there's two studs for the upper mount that go through the shock tower. We're going to remove the nut so we can remove the control arm. The control arm off, what we're going to do now is disconnect the ball joint for the tie rod end so we can disconnect our steering. Then we'll remove the lower control arm and the strut rod, and now we can remove the entire assembly as one. All right, now we're going to decompress the spring just to get it out of the way. What we're going to now is take the spindle off the lower control arm. Then we'll disconnect the brake line. It's going to remove the whole assembly to put it out of the way. You actually could hang the spindle if you wanted to out of the way, but definitely for video purposes, it'll be easier for us to remove it so you can see what we're doing.
Yeah, right now we're going to go ahead and take the whole assembly off, lower control arm, upper control arm, have it everything on a workbench where we can actually disassemble the spindle from the control arms themselves. To remove the lower control arm, we're going to first remove the lower strut rod.
All right, now we're going to remove the bolt for the lower control arm and get the whole assembly out of the car.
Once you have your factory suspension removed, remove the inner sleeve from your lower strut rod assembly, then use the bushing retainer as a template to drill your holes. Use a center punch to mark your 3 holes, and then drill out to 3/8. With the bearing retainer installed on both sides, we can tighten up the 3/8 cap screws. With the lower bearing retainer installed, you can now install the lower control arm. On the end of the strut rod, install your bearing spacer, the large washer, and the nylock nut. With the lower control arm installed, install the lower eccentric plate so that the hole is at the top on both sides. Make sure that both plates are facing the same direction. Run the bolt through, putting the nylock nut on the other side. With the lower arm bolted on, we can now reinstall the factory spindle and brakes. Install your ball joint boot first, then put on the spacer, the washer, your castle nut, and then follow that up with your cotter pin. At this point, we're going to go ahead and reconnect the outer tie rod into the spindle just to keep it in place while we put the upper control arm on. With the spindle installed and your steering linkage hooked back up, it's time to install the upper arm. Slide the cross shaft into place, push your bolts through, and then with the vehicle up in the air like it is now, it's easier to reach in from the bottom, put the washers and the nuts on from the backside. Before we tighten up the upper control arm, make sure you have the shim in there, then you can tighten everything down with an impact. After all the suspension components are installed, make sure to reattach your brakes. To install the upper shock mount, go underneath the fender and up through the upper shock mount. Spin the upper mount so that the holes align. Hold your plate. Make sure that the Ridetech logo is facing out towards you. Drop it on the top and install the 3 bolts. Before installing the coilover in place, make sure that your lower spacers are intact, your spanner nut, your Delrin washer, your spring, your upper washer, your retaining cap, and the cone are in place before installing them on the car. When you're installing the coilover into the upper mount, make sure that your lower Delrin ball is in place. Once it has gone through the upper mount, the upper Delrin ball will go on, then your aluminum cap, and then your nut. Before installing the bar, install the Delrin sleeve. Install the rubber over top of the sleeve. Do that on both sides before placing it on the car. With the sway bar in place, it's time to install the posi link. Before putting the posi link on the sway bar, sandwich the 2 bushings in between the hole on the lower bar. Drop in your posi link and slide it in the back hole on the upper control arm.
With the front suspension done, we've moved on to the rear. Now for the rear suspension, you shouldn't have to pull the pumpkin or anything out of the car. You have to remove obviously the leaf springs. If you have tailpipes, they probably have to go as well, at least for now. You may have to get custom ones later. So the first thing we're gonna do is unbolt the shocks and move on to the leaf springs. We're gonna remove the rear shocks. Now the bolt for the shock is up underneath your back seat. You definitely wanna hold it from underneath while you remove it.
Before we get around to installing the cradle itself, there are a few things we need to get out of the way. One being the fuel line and the other being the pinion snubber. Since this car has aftermarket exhaust, we want to mock up the cradle to make sure things like exhaust hangers aren't going to be in the way before we get around finally installing it. Now that we've got all the brackets and everything out of the way, we want to test fit the cradle to make sure we don't have interference anywhere else. So now with the cradle securely installed in place, what we want to do is we want to go through and mark all of our holes where our U-bolts and our thread forming bolts are going to go. This will allow us to take the cradle out, drill the holes, install the U-bolts, and then secure the cradle to the bottom of the car. For a little added corrosion protection, we're going to touch up all of our drill holes and our marks with some paint. With the paint touched up, we can install the U-bolts and then begin installing the cradle. With the cradle mounted securely in place, we're going to go ahead and drill out the 6 front mounting holes with a 5/16 drill bit to mount the thread forming bolts. Once your cradle is securely in place, you can attach the lower bar bracket to the axle housing. Use the supplied hardware to do this. With a lower bar bracket secured to the rear end housing, you can install your lower shock mount. Put a little blue Loctite on the shock stud itself before threading it into the bracket. Your lower 4-link bar will mount in your factory leaf spring location using the bushing supplied in the kit. The hardware threads through the frame rail, in through both bushings, and out the other side. With the lower bar installed in the rear axle mount, you can install the bolt through the tube spacers, mount the lower bar. Once your holes have been drilled in the front of the 4-link cradle, you can install the self-threading screws. When you receive the kit from us direct, the upper bars will already be pre-measured out for you. To keep from welding these in and melting the Delrin cage in the R-joint, we supply this tool to make the measurements correct. Set the tool length to the length of the upper bar. Tighten the bolts. You'll use this tool to weld in the upper bar. Now that the length has been determined using the upper bar we sent you, mock this into place using the hardware provided. Take your axle tabs, set those up so that you have 3.5 inches from the center of the bolt to the axle center line, then recheck your fitment. As you can tell on this particular bracket, we're going to need to trim a little bit to get a nice fit. We'll make sure that that's clearanced out to fit the axle tube before we weld it on. With the tabs welded on both sides, it's now okay to install both upper 4-link bars. On all of your coilovers, make sure that your rebalance setting is in the middle. This usually requires turning the knob all the way to the right and then backing it counterclockwise 12 clicks. With the vehicle on the ground, set your preload. To do this, tighten the spanner nut to the right until your desired ride height is achieved.
So John, thanks for coming out here and walking us through that installation. Obviously, it's a time-consuming installation, but from what you tell me, it's going to be worth it. What can we expect this car to drive like, handle like now that we have that suspension on it?
It's going to drive and perform like a modern Mustang would. Between the drivetrain that you've got, the suspension, the wheels and tires, you can expect performance that would be equivalent to a 2017, 2018 Mustang.
And what would you think time-wise for your amateur backyard mechanic to do this installation? Now, we talked about it's bolt-on.
Correct.
A little bit of welding obviously involved, but overall, what would you think time-wise?
A good solid 3-day weekend would do you.
Okay.
Make sure you get it aligned afterwards. Obviously, you know, unless you have that equipment at your house, that's going to be something you're going to need to seek out professional help to do.
Basically, like he said, probably a long weekend. Take your time, follow this video for the basics, be back on the road in no time.